9 days after Japanese bombers turned Pearl Harbor into an inferno, Chester Nimitz received a summons that would change naval history. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox had one question: how quickly could he travel? When Nimitz asked where he was headed, Knox delivered the stunning answer: he would command the Pacific Fleet, and the assignment would likely last years. The appointment defied logic. Nimitz was a 2-star admiral working a desk job at the Bureau of Navigation. He'd built his career in submarines, never commanding a battleship, the traditional prerequisite for fleet command. Roosevelt's decision meant leapfrogging 28 more senior flag officers for the most critical naval position in American history. The Chief of Naval Operations questioned his qualifications. Ernest King, newly appointed to lead the entire U.S. fleet, dismissed him as a bureaucrat unsuited for combat command. What made this choice even more remarkable? Nimitz had already refused this exact position 10 months earlier. In January 1941, when Roosevelt first offered him command of the Pacific Fleet, Nimitz had declined, arguing he was too junior and that jumping over 50 officers would damage Navy morale. Admiral Kimmel received that assignment instead, but December 7, 1941 changed everything. In 2 devastating hours, the battleship-centered Navy died, and the quiet submariner from Texas became the only logical choice to rebuild it. Admiral Husband Kimmel watched his fleet burn from his submarine base office. A spent machine gun bullet crashed through the window and struck his chest, leaving only a bruise. "It would have been merciful had it killed me," he murmured. 10 days later, Secretary Knox relieved him of command after personally inspecting the carnage. The statistics were staggering. 2,403 Americans died. The USS Arizona alone claimed 1,177 lives when an armor-piercing bomb detonated her forward magazine. 5 battleships sank outright. Arizona was a total loss. Oklahoma capsized with 429 men trapped inside, and California, West Virginia, and Nevada all went down. 3 more battleships sustained heavy damage. The Roberts Commission found Kimmel guilty of dereliction, citing his failure to conduct long-range reconnaissance, poor coordination with Army commanders, and underestimating Japanese capabilities. Kimmel had requested 250 reconnaissance aircraft from Washington but never received them. Crucially, decoded Japanese intelligence intercepts were never forwarded to Hawaii. He retired in disgrace, spending the remainder of his life seeking vindication that never came. Chester Nimitz didn't look like a fleet commander by traditional Navy standards. His expertise lay in submarines and diesel engines, not battleship tactics. From 1909 to 1913, he commanded 5 different submarines and eventually led the entire Atlantic submarine flotilla. He pioneered underway replenishment techniques that would prove essential in the vast Pacific theater. His only battleship flag duty was a brief command of Battleship Division, one from 1938 to 1939, ironically flying his flag aboard the Arizona, now a tomb beneath Pearl's waters. Yet Roosevelt saw what others missed. The Atlantic War would involve convoy escorts and anti-submarine operations. The Pacific War required carrier strikes, submarine interdiction, and island-hopping campaigns across enormous distances. Battleships were finished as the primary strike weapon. Carriers and submarines were ascendant, and Nimitz uniquely understood both. Roosevelt also needed someone who could rebuild morale without assigning blame, who could work with a shattered staff rather than conducting purges. Nimitz's Naval Academy yearbook described him as a man of cheerful yesterdays and confident tomorrows. In December 1941, that temperament mattered more than conventional credentials. Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor on Christmas morning 1941, stepping off a flying boat in civilian clothes. His first words revealed his priorities. "What news of the relief of Wake?" He was asking about offensive operations, not dwelling on the disaster behind him. Touring the harbor by boat that morning, he witnessed apocalypse. Oil slicks covered the water, charred debris floated everywhere, and the stench of burned oil and death hung heavy in the air. Arizona's superstructure jutted from the water like a gravestone. Oklahoma's hull lay exposed on her side. It was a graveyard. That evening, Nimitz shared Christmas dinner with Kimmel in what must have been an extraordinarily difficult moment. Rather than accusations, Nimitz offered compassion. The same thing could have happened to anyone. It was a generous sentiment from the man chosen to replace him. The change of command ceremony on December 31st occurred aboard the submarine USS Grayling. Every battleship was sunk or damaged, leaving no other suitable deck. The symbolism was perfect. The old battleship navy had been destroyed, and the instruments of the new Pacific War submarines, carriers, and intelligence now took center stage. Nimitz's first great decision came not on a bridge but in a conference room. Kimmel's staff officers expected disgrace and reassignment. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, the fleet intelligence officer, assumed his career was finished. Captain Charles McMorris, the war plans officer, prepared for transfer. Every member of Kimmel's inner circle believed they'd be blamed for failing to anticipate the attack. Nimitz called them together and, in his quiet Texas manner, expressed complete confidence in them. He retained every single one. When Layton requested destroyer command, expecting his intelligence career to end in humiliation, Nimitz refused. "I want you to be the Admiral Nagamo of my staff," he said, referencing the Japanese carrier commander who led the Pearl Harbor strike. "I want your every thought, every instinct, as you believe Nagamo might have them." Layton became the only staff officer besides the flag secretary with standing permission to enter Nimitz's office any time. He remained at Nimitz's side for the entire war. This decision revealed Nimitz's philosophy. He was interested in capability, not blame. Kimmel's staff knew the Pacific Fleet intimately, its ships, personnel, capabilities, and limitations better than any replacements. Firing them would satisfy public anger but cripple operational effectiveness. Keeping them sent a clear message. We're focused on winning, not settling scores. The attack shattered more than ships, it shattered doctrine. Pre-war Navy doctrine followed Alfred Thayer Mahan's principles, emphasizing concentrated battleship fleets as decisive weapons. Carriers were considered useful for scouting but not capital ships, capable of deciding engagements. December 7th ended that debate permanently. With the battleships on the bottom, carriers became the queens of the fleet by necessity. They could strike at ranges beyond visual contact, projecting power across hundreds of miles and attacking enemy fleets without ever seeing them. The old Mahanian vision of concentrated gun duels was obsolete. Nimitz recognized this immediately, shifting strategic focus toward carriers and submarine warfare, the two arms that remained intact and would ultimately defeat Japan. But first, he needed to restore confidence through action. In January 1942, Nimitz proposed carrier raids against Japanese bases. Many considered the idea too risky. The carriers were precious few, and losing even one would be catastrophic. Vice Admiral Halsey volunteered to strike the Marshall Islands, a courageous decision that permanently endeared him to Nimitz. The raids beginning February 1st did limited material damage but tremendous psychological good. The fleet was fighting back. More strikes followed Halsey's raids on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April, and the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, where the Japanese advance was checked for the first time. Then came Midway in June 1942, relying on intelligence. From Layton and cryptanalysts who'd broken Japanese codes, Nimitz knew the attack was coming. The date, direction, even call signs. He positioned 3 carriers in ambush northeast of Midway. When Japanese carriers approached on June 4th, American dive bombers caught them with armed and fueled aircraft on deck. The resulting fires were catastrophic. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, their most experienced pilots, and their offensive capability. 6 months after taking command, Nimitz had turned disaster into strategic advantage. The quiet submariner nobody wanted had become the architect of victory. The staff everyone expected him to fire became the team that won the war. December 1941 was the Pacific Fleet's darkest hour, but also the moment American naval warfare was reborn. Roosevelt had chosen the admiral nobody wanted, and in doing so, chose exactly the man the Pacific needed.